just relaxed and paying attention.
Well, I guess it's okay for me to... Welcome back to 21st Century Radio. I'm Dr. Bob Hieronymus, our executive producer, and research assistant is Laura Courtney. Our engineer is Anita Brockington. Our guest tonight, well, our second guest tonight, is a dear friend of mine from the old days, so to speak. Our guest this hour is Bradbury Cort Lindahl, another independent investigator of historical anomalies who has joined us previously on 21st Century Radio. Tonight, we will return to the subject of how the mysterious Oak Island in Nova Scotia relates to American history, and then touch on his forthcoming book about the White House Meridian and the monuments situated along its meridian. Now, much of this information can be found in Cort Lindahl's book, Oak Island and the Arcadian Mysteries, which explores the connections between this mysterious island and other mysterious spots like Rennes-le-Château in France, as they say, and in France, and Shoeborough Hall in England, and even California's Mount Shasta. He examines why the theme of Arcadia is present in so many different places, giving the appearance of an intentional application of literary themes with Rosicrucian and Masonic overtones. Cort theorizes that there was a kind of mystery school organization meant to support the notion of the Republic and instill an appreciation for things like the Declaration of Independence and the Declaration of Nathaniel Bacon of Bacon's Rebellion. Welcome back to 21st Century Radio, Cort.
Hey, it's great to be here, Dr. Bob. It's always a thrill to talk to you, and I appreciate you having me on.
Well, I hope you're sitting up straight and your eyes are straight ahead and you're not chewing gum, right? Are you?
Exactly.
Well, that's a bad thing. Well, you know, we throw people off the... Oh, boy. Okay. For our new listeners, please give us a very brief description of Oak Island and why so many people have sponsored elaborate digs there searching for treasure.
Well, Oak Island is one of these stories that has been kind of wrapped up in folklore and mythology in a more modern kind of way. But there are a lot of historical overtones that suggest that something could have actually been hidden there, including large amounts of treasure or documents and things like this. And it kind of feeds us into a kind of Rosicrucian tradition of Christian Rosenkreuz being, his body being hidden in an undisclosed location in a mountain with documents and important historical items. So Oak Island kind of has those overtones as well as just the fact that a treasure could be located there. So these overtones, I think, are related to the theme of Arcadia, which goes all the way back to ancient Greek mythology and the character of Arcas, who through a series of events, he and his mother were cast into the sky by Zeus as the constellations Ursa Major and Ursa Minor, with Ursa Minor being Arcas himself and his tail including the pole star. So this presents us with kind of an allegory that spatial relationships and the creation of what may be termed a prime meridian is important in any appreciation of the Arcadian theme, which in turn, the Arcadian theme became kind of a banner of the elite and royal interests of Europe, starting with Byzantine emperors and being appreciated by people like Lorenzo de' Medici, who some of his progeny became the queens of France. And it became accepted in France that this theme was also appreciated, and kind of ties us into some of the theories of Mary Magdalene coming to France and how certain groups of people believed they were related to them, such as the Plantagenets, French royalty, and others. Charlemagne, even a little earlier in history, sort of displayed these values of Arcadia, which is also considered kind of a pastoral utopia that would be, longed for, that they would try to replicate in what they did and things they did. And this also became associated with the, quote, fallen kings of France and England and Scotland as well. And Gary touched on a lot of information about the Stuarts earlier, the Stuart kings of England, who seem to have an appreciation of this theme as well. And it also manifested itself in an organization called the Academy of Arcadia of the Vatican, which was kind of an artist guild that promoted art and literature and music that represented this theme. So we know, for instance, the Stuart kings of England, a lot of their problems arose from their Catholic faith in opposition to the previous Elizabethan and Tudor values of rejecting the Catholic Church from their country and expelling them from their country. And still at the same time, they ended up with rulers that were still Catholic, that had, through their relationships with the Medici family and the royalty to Europe, for instance, King Charles I's wife was the daughter of Marie de Medici, who was the Queen of France at the time. So there's all kinds of connections in this theme in an appreciation of royalty and fallen kings, that they saw this as a way in allegory to kind of harken back to a better time that was more of a utopia in which they were in charge of everything. So a lot of these stories revolve around those kinds of things, and later we'll see how this became an American theme with a different kind of purpose to it as well.
Well, you connect the mystery of Oak Island to a similar story present in Philip Sidney's book Arcadia, printed, I think you touched on this, over 200 years before the Oak Island money pit was ever heard of. What's the connection here?
Correct. Philip Sidney was an interesting character who lived in the period just before Sir Francis Bacon and the works of Shakespeare became more popular. And as an author, he had a lot of influence on those things. Even a couple of the Shakespeare plays are based on some of the themes in his book Arcadia that was first printed in 1580. So as I began to research these kind of treasure myths like Rennes-le-Château and the mystery of Shugborough Hall, where both places are associated with Arcadian imagery through the painting of Nicolas Poussin, who painted the Shepherds of Arcadia. So a lot of people have been fascinated with that imagery in league with these stories. So Philip Sidney, in his book, there's one passage in the book that resembles the original folklore of Oak Island, in the three men finding the money pit on Oak Island and beginning to excavate it and going through these layers of logs and as the story goes, eventually a graven stone was found at the bottom of the pit with a coded message on it that kind of resembles the Enochian themes valued by Freemasons of that era of 1795 and later, when the story first became exposed to the public. So I looked into all of this and studied the origins of Arcadia from the Greek beginnings of it through the later values of the same theme, and I stumbled upon Philip Sidney's book Arcadia and found almost the same story in the pages of Arcadia, how a man had been sent as kind of a ploy so the main character, Musidorus, could escape with the object of his desire, Miss Pamela, and he sent his servant to go recover the treasure, and the whole description of this matches the story of Oak Island. So this is very interesting in that, of course, French Acadia, which was the name of the region before Nova Scotia, means Arcadia in French, and it had been named Arcadia by explorers Verrazzano and Italian cartographer Bolognini as Arcadia previous to that. So this is kind of an expression of the French royalty at that time, who had commissioned Verrazzano and everything in the naming of Arcadia. So it was terribly interesting to find a book called Arcadia that included the same story, which incidentally was later in about 1620 amended by the first Baron of Nova Scotia. So there's another important connection to the whole mystery, that why he chose to amend the book, and obviously in doing so he valued the book, and part of his reason for that may have been the similarities in that passage of the book to the story of Oak Island.
It's almost like the stories for treasure. You've searched for treasure, haven't you?
Not really. I usually, what I do more is research the stories to see if there's any kind of historical validity to them. In my work as an archaeologist, I found all kinds of things in the wilderness and places that may be considered historical treasures and things like that. I used to work in the area of Jamestown and Williamsburg, which was very interesting in that light, as far as finding historical information that revealed things about history. But no, I've never found a treasure myself, but it is very interesting, and I don't blame other people for actively searching.
Well, it depends on what we think of what treasure is. I mean, if it's economic, then that's one level, but when it gets to be historic from the standpoint of being a part of history, it's kind of archetypal, and that's what I meant by that.
Well, what I think is really that's part of the treasure, and that's not to say there isn't any treasure or anything of value at Oak Island, for instance, but in studying these things, it's kind of like a mystery school overtone where you discover hidden parts of history that aren't necessarily unrecorded, but are kind of neglected in the common stories of the way history is told, that if you really dig in and go looking, that you'll find other stories that are really amazing in that context. And finding that story, for instance, that Philip Sidney wrote about Oak Island, I believe, or something similar that was applied to Oak Island later, that you come to the realization that part of the reason for some of these more storied legends is to teach you something else, kind of in the tradition of the mystery schools of ancient Rome, the early Christian mystery schools, and the Eleusinian mysteries, and things like this that are part of history that are meant for the initiate or the seeker to figure things out for themselves in a way.
Well, we're going to take our first break, and when we come back, I'm going to ask you a question you're going to have to study up on, and that is, who is General Alexander of the Continental Army, and how does his life relate to the Oak Island treasure? We'll be back.
You got it.
With our I'm glad I do got it. We'll be back with Cort Lindahl, The Mystery of Oak Island and Arcadia, and links to treasure stories in the Bruton Parish Vault. Oh, boy, I spent so many years on the Bruton Parish Vault. Cort's website is survivalcell.blogspot.com, and you can also find him on YouTube. You can also find previous 21st Century Radio Archive shows posted weekly for free. That's unusual. We'll be right back.
Hi, this is Dr. Bernie Siegel, author of Love, Medicine, and Miracles, and recently a book on parenting, love, magic, and mud pies. And you're listening to 21st Century Radio with Bob Hieronymus.
I made a few mud pies in my life, as a matter of fact. Oh, yes. I had a little friend whose name was Jimmy, and he was a black guy, and he was a little bit smaller than I. And he and I used to dig out all different places in dirt, and we dug up clay. Brown clay, of course, but blue, green, red. He was great. We had the best of times. And our big problem was, of course, when I brought him home, my family wasn't too happy with me. But that's always been that way. That's why I had to leave to begin with.
I think we all did that.
Yes, I'm afraid
definitely.
So. Oh, I had such a good time with this guy. Okay, Cort. Cort Lindahl, by the way, is our guest right now. The Mystery of Oak Island and Arcadia links to treasure stories in the Bruton Parish vault, and more. We're going to get to this. But what right now, who is General Alexander of the Continental Army, and how does his life relate to the Oak Island treasure? You got 10 seconds.
Well, General Alexander was a descendant of the same Alexander family of the first Baron of Nova Scotia,
Oh, my.
who, under the auspices of Charles I, attempted to start a new Scotland or Scottish colony in Nova Scotia, which eventually failed due to political agreements between England and France, where Acadia or Nova Scotia kept changing hands between French and English interests so many times during the 17th and 18th centuries. So it's interesting that after the English Civil War, which Charles I lost and eventually led to his beheading, the Alexander family moved to America. And let me briefly note also that when Charles I was beheaded, his last words were from Philip Sidney's book, Arcadia, prior to his execution. So this kind of displays the Stuart value and the French royal value of Arcadia that I stated before. So it's interesting that the Alexander family made their way to America. They were now somewhat persecuted by the parliamentarian government of England that existed after Charles I's defeat, and they became really denizens of Northern California, and even Alexandria, Virginia, is named for the Alexander family. So prior to the American Revolution, another William Alexander that was descendant of the original Baron of Nova Scotia's brother actually returned to Scotland and attempted to regain the titles of the Baron of Nova Scotia and Earl of Stirling that the original Baron had held. And at that time, the Scottish peerage awarded him these titles, but kind of understandably in this era, just before the Revolution, the English Parliament put the kibosh on that and refused to actually officially award him those titles. So it's interesting that there was an attempt by an American to get these titles at that time, and actually as history wore on after the Revolution, there was a strong movement to make Nova Scotia part of the United States that lasted until about the 1890s. So it's very interesting in this realm of Arcadia and how the original Baron of Nova Scotia kind of amended Philip Sidney's book with a new chapter, that there's all this connection to the theme of Arcadia as presented by Philip Sidney and the story within the pages of the book that's very similar to the original Oak Island folklore.
Well, let me get to something that I know that our listeners want me to ask, which I don't necessarily think is exactly what I want to ask, but I think this is important for them. Cort, what is your theory about what treasure is buried at Oak Island, if any?
Well, that's a good question, Dr. Bob.
Well, for $250 and a carton of Cokes.
Like Jeopardy.
That's right.
No,
Give us
it
your
could
best
be
shot.
a lot of different things, and in fact, Oak Island could have been used at different times to store wealth from privateers or monies or gold specie that had been recovered in times of war, like the siege of the Fortress Louisbourg, where English interests took that over, and a large amount of gold went missing after that. But prior to that, even people like Sir Francis Drake or any other number of historical figures could have used Oak Island to store things that they kind of wanted to keep off of the books. But the way this relates to American history is interesting, that through a series of looking at English naval records and things like that, I found that it's entirely possible that's what's known as the D'Anville expedition, which was a French expedition to try to take back over Nova Scotia and even raid Boston at the time.
Oh, my.
May have involved them bringing gold that was left over from the 1745 Jacobite rebellion to Oak Island that could be used by America in the upcoming American Revolution, or to use as funds to get this going and make it so it would eventually happen. And so there's a lot of evidence that could at least be true. So that's one of the ways that's interesting in league with the Stewart family. And this goes back to some of the things Gary Giannotti was telling us earlier about the Stewart family and their influence in the American Revolution as well. So these kind of stories like that could have been somewhat developed to cover up the political truth of what happened, and that some of this money may have been bound for America eventually, because there were a lot of actual people from the American colonies who had been awarded land in Nova Scotia prior to that, including people like the Longfellow family of the famous poet, and the Delano family related to FDR, who also showed a great interest in Oak Island and even invested in one of the companies that attempted to recover something there.
Mm-hmm.
So there is kind of a secret stream of knowledge where people who were in a position to know what was going on there showing interest in recovering treasure later there as well.
Well, how does Oak Island possibly relate to Freemasonic concepts, or how they relate to Solomonic and Enochian themes valued by Freemasons?
Well, if we look at even the story in Philip Sidney's Arcadia as compared to the way the story's told, that the three young men who found the money pit eventually dug through 9 layers of logs, which is analogous somewhat to the story of Enoch with the 9-layered chamber.
Oh, well.
And digging down through that, they found a graven stone at the bottom, known as the 90-foot stone in Oak Island lore, which has never been seen, but it was recorded and seen by people at the time and things like that. So it really matches kind of the Royal Arch notion of the 9-layered chamber of Enoch, in which there's a stone hidden in the 9th chamber with the unspoken word of God, the tetragrammaton graven upon it, that's also referred to in Philip Sidney's version of the story. So that's very interesting as well. And we know the whole story of Enoch also relates to King Solomon later finding the 9-layered chamber when he was building Solomon's temple on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. So these are stories that are valued by Freemasons and Rosicrucians and other people who value kind of allegorical mysteries in this realm. So a lot of people have speculated that there are Freemasonic overtones to the Oak Island treasure, and frankly, this would fit what I was telling you about the d'Anville expedition earlier, because the Duc d'Anville's name was Jean-Baptiste Rochefoucauld. And as we go to pre-Revolutionary War France, Thomas Jefferson was very close friends with his son, and so was Benjamin Franklin. And they, as we know, they were involved in Freemasonry there, and they attended literary salons and artist salons with this group of kind of noble Frenchmen that also had a vision for France, I believe, as a republic as well prior to their revolution.
Which kind of got out of hand.
There's a lot of connections like that as well.
Well, who's Francis Nicholson, and why does his name pop up in places of mystery and intrigue?
Well, Francis Nicholson is a really interesting character in the kind of early history of Williamsburg and later history of Jamestown, because in Virginia, because at one point they moved the colonial capital to Williamsburg because it was closer to fresh water supplies, basically was one of the major reasons for that. But he was known to have developed the plan of Williamsburg, which kind of, in modern terms, and a lot of people speculate that this represents a, quote, New Jerusalem or New Atlantis design of architecture. And we do see this in Williamsburg with the octagonal structure of the powder magazine, hearkening back to even the Dome of the Rock or the Tower of Winds in ancient Athens that was valued by all of these Byzantine rulers and later nobility of Europe that I speculate valued the Arcadian theme as well. So it all goes back to a value of Greek mythology and the story of Arcadia in a lot of ways that hasn't really been revealed before. So Francis Nicholson designed the street plan of Williamsburg, which actually may have inspired the design of the National Mall. He also designed the street plan of Annapolis, Maryland, which is very interesting and ordered if you look at it, the original early street plan. He was one of the founders of the Trinity Church in Newport, Rhode Island, where the Newport Tower is located, which has a lore all of its own that fits the Arcadian theme as well and fits into the whole value of this via the Stuart family even. And then finally, he was the one-time governor of Nova Scotia as well. So throughout his career, he was always in a position to have been privy about what was going on with these mysteries and may have even lent a hand to the creation of some of these kind of historical mysteries or hidden treasure legends, such as the Bruton Vault in colonial Williamsburg.
Yeah, we'll touch on that in just a little while. So he had been aware of the concept of a New Jerusalem?
Well, I only would speculate that that's true because of the design of Williamsburg itself resembles that. It's a linear array of church, octagonal structure, governor's palace, the colonial capitals at one end, and then Wren Hall on the campus of William and Mary is at the other end. So it's a very ordered arrangement of architecture that has some of the overtones that indicate that that may have been part of his motivation for designing it that way.
Mm-hmm. Well, does this relate to Francis Bacon's vision of the New Atlantis?
Yes, in some ways it does. Other people term the New Atlantis style of architecture to the New Jerusalem style of architecture to the New Atlantis concept of Sir Francis Bacon, which has some things in common with the Arcadian theme in that it's a utopia where people are guided by rational thought and still have some faith, but the overlaying, driving force of what they believe is based on science and rationality and other aspects of the Baconian kind of view. We know he wrote books about, the ordered way of investigating science and things like that, that also lends itself to these ordered arrays of architecture. That, here we have, one initiate might see it as a New Jerusalem and another person familiar with Sir Francis Bacon might see it as a New Atlantis. And I know, as we've discussed before, there's often different layers or levels of understanding when we look at things like that.
Well, that's something to look at, all right, because every time I've tried to visit Bruton Parish, and we've been there about 3 times or so, I feel something there. What I mean by that is I can feel that there's another level of energy going on, and I think it's one of higher consciousness, which may have something to do with Bruton Parish itself and its importance.
Sure. I've felt that way when I've been there too. I visited there a few summers ago, and it was interesting as soon as I walked into the bell tower room of the church, what you see there is the tombstone of Nathaniel Bacon.
Tell us a little bit about Nathaniel Bacon while we're at this point.
Okay. Well, there were 2 Nathaniel Bacons in early Virginia at the same time in the late 1600s, one of whom had been there before, the elder Nathaniel Bacon, and both of these men were related to Sir Francis Bacon from the same family that he had come from. So the elder Nathaniel Bacon was kind of more part of the landed gentry who had been there for a while earlier, and the younger Nathaniel Bacon came there later. And he was kind of given property on the outskirts of the settlement where the later arrivals had been placed out there to act as kind of a defensive band against the Native Americans at that time. So Nathaniel Bacon kind of became disillusioned with the landed gentry that had already been there for a while, that owned more of the property and controlled the economy and everything of early Williamsburg and Jamestown. And he proceeded to incite a rebellion against the landed gentry, in which he made his declaration of Nathaniel Bacon that stated his reasons for doing this. And the Declaration of Nathaniel Bacon is said to be one of the things that inspired Thomas Jefferson in his penning of the Declaration of Independence. So as part of that story, the rebels at first got the upper hand and took over Williamsburg and much of mainland Virginia and drove Governor Berkeley to the eastern shore of Virginia. But eventually, Nathaniel Bacon died unexpectedly. So one of the aspects about that that's interesting is no one ever knew where he was buried. So what I found in my examination of the Bruton Vault mystery was that it really meant, in a kind of Rosicrucian way, because there's a lot of Rosicrucian stories that involve missing remains of Christian Rosencrantz and other figures like Charlemagne, where mysteries were created about where their bodies were hidden with valuables and important documents and things like that. But I think in the end that Nathaniel Bacon's supporters had clandestinely buried him in the Bruton Parish churchyard, and this led to the notion later that wasn't brought forth until Marie Bauer Hall investigated the Bruton Vault, that the younger Nathaniel Bacon had brought a stash of Sir Francis Bacon's papers to Jamestown, which was eventually moved to the Bruton Parish Church, where Nathaniel Bacon's tombstone is located, the older one.
Pardon me now, but we got to take a break, Cort. And when we return, we're going to move on into the areas of patriots of the Episcopalian Church created mysteries using classic Greek and Roman imagery. I think you've touched on that a little earlier, and I think it's extremely important. We'll be back with our guest, Cort Lindahl, the mystery of Oak Island. God, it sounds like a little organ, pipe organ. Yes. Oh, yes. Mystery of... Did you say you lassie? The mystery of Oak Island and Arcadia, links to treasured stories in the Bruton Parish Vault, and more. Cort's website is survivalcell.blogspot.com, and you can also find him on YouTube. You can also find previous 21st Century Radio Archive shows posted weekly for free on YouTube.
This is Bill McKibben, author and environmental activist. You're listening to 21st Century Radio with Dr. Bob Hieronymus. Thanks for tuning in, and thanks for doing all you can to try to change the energy future of this country.
Tell him, Bill. You tell him. Yeah, we're all for that guy, Bill McKibben. We are so fortunate to have him on so many times, and I don't think he does too many other interviews anymore. Yeah, he's too busy. Well, we're busy too. And our guest is Cort Lindahl. He's a good friend of ours. The mystery of Oak Island and Arcadia, and the links to treasure stories in the Bruton Parish Vault, and more. We talked a little bit about them. Are you with us?
Yes.
Well, you're under arrest. Hands up, guys. All right, now, but assume the position. Now, here's the question for $30,000. You believe that patriots of the Episcopal Church created mysteries using classic Greek and Roman imagery as part of this kind of mystery school application to intelligence services. Tell us about it.
I do.
Oh, good.
I think Thomas Jefferson was among those who attended the Bruton Parish Church during his time as a student at William and Mary, and later as governor of Virginia as well. And I think he was aware of all of these things. Really, one of the most interesting things I've found lately has to do with some of his heritage stemming from his mother's Randolph family, which will link us back to Philip Sidney, who wrote the book Arcadia.
Oh.
And what I found was that during Elizabethan times, Queen Elizabeth's, quote, spy master was Sir Francis Walsingham.
Uh-oh.
And what I found was that immediate family members of his worked with him in these intelligence gathering activities.
So whole families would be spies?
Well, this family specifically is. I can say that.
They got a good job. All right.
That they all had more value of family in the past because of primogeniture and the way titles and inheritances were divvied up. But in the case of Walsingham, I was interesting to find that he had, first of all, his son-in-law was Philip Sidney, who wrote the book Arcadia that I've referred to before. And then I found that both of his brothers-in-law was a man named, first one was named Robert Beale, related to the Beale family of Virginia that gives us the, quote, Beale treasure of Virginia. His other brother-in-law was a man named Thomas Randolph that came from the very same family as Thomas Jefferson's mother. So Thomas Jefferson is actually related to Francis Walsingham, the spy master, Robert Beale, Philip Sidney, and Thomas Randolph.
The gang. It's the gang. It's the same old gang.
So bam, we can even see this in his heritage, and his name Thomas possibly could have come from Thomas Randolph. There was another later Thomas Randolph who was a contemporary author and poet of Sir Francis Bacon's in England that he's directly related to as well. So it's really interesting that later in the 19th century, the Randolph family included family members named Philip Sidney Randolph and Algernon Sidney Randolph. And here Algernon Sidney is another person in 17th century England who was somewhat of a radical and had a lot of different political ideas, somewhat in the vein of having a republic instead of a constitutional monarchy that they had in England at the time. Mm-hmm. And he was also beheaded eventually due to these views.
That serves him right.
Algernon Sidney is another one of these people that is said to have inspired Thomas Jefferson in his penning of the Declaration of Independence. So if we look back at the Bruton Vault theory that I have, that the Declaration of Nathaniel Bacon was important, we have the overtones of the Declaration of Independence. Thomas Jefferson's also related to Robert Beale, who was one of the spies of Sir Walsingham, and we know that one of the cipher keys for the famous Beale treasure in Virginia is also the Declaration of Independence.
Whoa.
So we're seeing here that kind of the American mysteries are leading us to the tenets of our country.
Well, that's
the mystery solved.
Yeah, and that's the key too. Richard Montgomery. Who was Richard Montgomery? And he's a Revolutionary War hero. Why was he so important?
Well, he's an interesting character because he was the subject of one of the first veterans memorials in the United States. There's the Montgomery Memorial at the St. Paul's Chapel in New York City, which we know was the first capital of the United States. And St. Paul's Cathedral is interesting for having survived the 9/11 attacks, even though it was so close to the World Trade Center. And the altarpiece within St. Paul's Chapel was made by Pierre L'Enfant, who also designed the street plan of Washington, D.C. Mm-hmm. But the Montgomery Memorial is interesting because it was brought over during the war, because Montgomery had been killed in the siege of Montreal in Canada when we attempted to invade Canada at that time. So because of all the major ports on the East Coast being blockaded, this memorial was brought in pieces in lead-lined caskets, as the description goes, to Edenton, North Carolina, which was the first capital of North Carolina, where it was hidden until after the war. And frankly, the monument was so well hidden that they had to bring Benjamin Franklin in to try to figure out where it was so they could reassemble the monument, and they decided to put it at St. Paul's Chapel because that had been a meeting place of many patriots like Alexander Hamilton and others during the war and just after the war.
Well,
so
I'm sorry.
It's interesting that a piece of the Montgomery Memorial is still missing.
Yeah, I think I stole it. Yeah.
Go ahead.
I'm only kidding. I love this man because of what he did for Benjamin Franklin. He lost his life up in, as you mentioned, Montreal in a snowstorm, and he was his what would you call his soldiers were not acting together. They were not strong, and he had to show them how to get killed.
Yes, he made a sacrifice for our country, and that's one of the reasons they memorialized him in the way they did, and why it's an important Veterans Memorial in United States history.
Well, I'm so glad you mentioned that, because I think he was a very important person who didn't get to live to 1976. I mean, he died before that, which was too bad, because he deserved something better than that, in my opinion.
He did. He was very valued, and a hero, or they wouldn't have made the memorial for him. And that's why it's interesting that if you look at the monument today, on top of it, there's a funerary urn there that is just a reproduction that they've put there, and they fit this onto the monument, but the original one was never recovered with the rest of the statue. So that's kind of an enduring mystery as to where the missing piece of the Montgomery Memorial is. And it's even more interesting, too, because the same artist, Caffieri, also had created busts of Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson. And one of those busts of Benjamin Franklin is on display at Monticello, Thomas Jefferson's home today. So some people feel that there might be markings, here we go back to Gary Giannotti again, or hidden symbols on these sculptures that may reveal the location of the hidden piece of the Montgomery Memorial. So here's kind of a true American mystery, again, in the vein of all these kind of Rosicrucian stories and hidden treasure legends that really mean something in the context of American history, and that he was the subject of the first American Veterans Memorial ever.
Back to Bruton Parish in regards to Maria Bauer again.
Yes.
You say she was a little off in her conclusions. Where did she make her errors? In what area?
I think that she wasn't wrong. She had a good feel for everything that was going on, and did find some things when she excavated there and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
But obviously she didn't have access to the internet that we have today.
Yeah.
You know, everything she got was from libraries and things like that. And she was a little preoccupied with the kind of theosophic and New Age views of Sir Francis Bacon and Nathaniel Bacon's possible involvement in this.
Mm-hmm.
So when I looked at all of that, I broke it down, and from examining it, it just kind of come to the conclusion that the entire thing was more about the missing remains of Nathaniel Bacon in a kind of Rosicrucian way. That was a mystery, and those have never been found or identified anywhere. There's a couple of different locations in Virginia where people think he was, but there's things about even her excavation that indicated somebody else had been buried there that wasn't recorded, in a kind of elaborate coffin that was found, a piece of it, in her excavations. And I feel this that Nathaniel Bacon's followers probably just secretly buried him in the Bruton Parish churchyard, which would have been proper, as that was the only church in the area where he was from and where he owned his land, the Curl's Neck Plantation along the James River, which incidentally was right next door to the Wilton House Plantation of William Randolph II, who was also a forebearer of Thomas Jefferson. And William Randolph II had named his house after Wilton House, where Philip Sidney had written Arcadia. So this all goes back to a Randolph family appreciation of Philip Sidney, I believe, because Thomas Randolph was Philip Sidney's uncle.
Oh, my God.
Right, so they were all closely related. So the
Awesome.
Randolph family, which is one of the most well-known first families of Virginia, a lot of people refer to William Randolph II and his wife as the Adam and Eve of Virginia because they're related to all the most important Patriot families later, Washington, and so on.
And with that, we've got to stop. Brother Cort Lindahl, The Mystery of Oak Island and Arcadia and Links to Treasure Stories in the Bruton Parish Vault and more. Look forward to having you on air again in the future, Cort. See ya next week, friends.
Always here for you, Dr. Bob.
Thank you. I'll be right there.